Today we're going to look at Hosea chapter 11. The passage begins with a reference to Israel's exodus from Egypt, which is famous because it's quoted in the beginning of the Gospel of Matthew. In Hosea it is not a reference to the coming of the Messiah, but a description of God's dealings with Israel in the past. Yahweh describes the way he has looked after his people and contrasts his love and mercy and guidance with their unresponsiveness and lack of gratitude. There is contrast between his actions and theirs. He teaches them and calls them and looks after them. They refuse to turn to him and refuse to understand that he is the one who heals them. The image used to describe Yahweh's relationship to Israel is this time not that of a husband and wife, but of a parent and their child. Israel is called the son and the child of Yahweh, and the actions that God performs on behalf of his people are those that a parent, quite often a mother, would do for their children: teach them to walk, feed them, lift them up in their arms. The whole section then is based on the contrast between the love of a parent and the unresponsiveness and ingratitude of the child. And this leads to the second section, verses 5 to 7. These verses are slightly difficult because the Hebrew text literally says, "They shall not return to the land of Egypt." I'm not going to explore this textual difficulty, and I will leave you to consult the commentaries. And I'll proceed on the understanding that the NRSV's translation is correct, and the meaning of the text is, "They shall return to the land of Egypt." Some people understand the return to the land of Egypt as a reference to diplomatic negotiations. And if this is the case, we have here another reference to Israel's sin, the attempt of the people to enlist the help of Egypt and to get involved in diplomatic alliances which were not according to the will of Yahweh. More likely, however, the reference to return to the land of Egypt is a reference to captivity, and therefore here we have moved from description of the sin to description of the future judgment. The problem then is, why does Hosea imply that Israel is going to be dominated by two different powers, Egypt and Assyria? It is possible that Hosea is thinking of a literal exile to Egypt and suggesting that some people will go to Assyria and other people will be deported to Egypt. More likely here, Egypt is used in a symbolic metaphorical sense as a place of oppression. And part of the reason for its use here is the beginning of chapter 11. In the past, God saved Israel out of Egypt, and this demonstrated his ability to care for them and his love for them. In the future, he is going to reverse their salvation history, and he is going to send them to another place of oppression and injustice, which metaphorically can be described as Egypt, but on a historical and literary plane actually refers to Assyria. Verse 6 continues the description of future judgment. The sword is personified as agent of God's wrath, and it ravages, consumes, and devours the people of Israel. You can see the reality referred to by this image here on one of the Assyrian reliefs, which depicts Assyrian siege of a city and the ensuing massacres. There are a number of uncertainties as to how the text is actually to be translated, and if you check the commentaries and different English translations, you will see that these underlined phrases and others as well are translated very differently. But the overall meaning and thrust of the passage is clear enough. Israel is to suffer devastation because it has rejected the goodness of Yahweh and has turned away from him. Verse 8 marks the beginning of a new section. The speaker is still the same, but the style changes and the theme changes as well, and the transition is very abrupt. From proclamation of judgment and complaints about Israel's ungratefulness, suddenly we have rhetorical questions and declaration of Yahweh's mercy. There are four rhetorical questions here, which remind us a little bit of chapter 6, verse 4. And again, God here sounds like a frustrated parent who does not know what to do with their disobedient child. And here this follows very naturally from the parental imagery in the beginning of the passage. The main point is that although judgment has started, Yahweh does not feel able to see this judgment through and to bring complete destruction on Israel. The two cities mentioned here, Admah and Zeboim, are mentioned in Deuteronomy and Genesis alongside Sodom and Gomorrah. And so what Yahweh obviously has in mind here is that he cannot destroy Israel completely in the same way that he destroyed Sodom, Gomorrah and these two cities for their sin. And the reason for that is not to be sought in any way with Israel. The people have not changed, they have not returned to Yahweh. The reason is to be sought within God himself. His heart is overturned and his compassion grows warm and tender. And because of his compassion for his people, he cannot bring himself to destroy them completely. God's compassion for Israel results in the fact that he decides not to execute his fierce anger. But it also has some positive consequences as well. It leads to God actively bringing about the restoration of his people. That restoration begins with the Lord roaring like a lion, which gives the signal for his children to begin to return from the places of their oppression: Egypt, Assyria, and the West. The lion imagery quite often depicts Yahweh as a judge, as one who comes and destroys throughout the Old Testament, but in Hosea as well, in chapter 5 for example. And here the lion image is used in a completely different way. Judgment as well as salvation comes from the person of Yahweh. And here salvation has the final word. He's not just a lion who destroys, but also a lion who restores and brings his people back. So let's sum up. What are the main images in this chapter? The passage uses parental imagery to describe God's relationship to his people. God is like a parent who continually and constantly looks after his child, but the child refuses to listen to his parent and to respond. The child's disobedience leads to judgment, but judgment is overcome by the mercy and compassion of God. What makes this passage so striking is the glimpse it affords into the inner life of God. God is not portrayed as a distant observer who logically and rationally decides his responses and actions without any emotion. On the contrary, he is a passionate parent who is torn between his justifiable anger on one hand and his love and compassion for his little child on the other. And in this struggle, mercy and compassion have the final word. Chapter 11, therefore, plays an important role in the book of Hosea. It proclaims the fact that beyond the sin of Israel, beyond the judgment and destruction which this sin inevitably brings, there is a future with God, a future of restoration and salvation, and most importantly, a future which is guaranteed by the mercy and unending love of God. A future which does not rest on anything Israel can or will do, a future which rests on the fact that God, the God who has brought his people out of Egypt, will bring them again out of the house of oppression and slavery, because he loves them and continues to care for them.